So today we have with us Dr. Shainool Jiwa, the head of constituency studies and a specialist on the Fatimid Empire. Dr. Jiwa, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to talk a little bit about the Fatimid Empire, generally as an empire.
Sure.
We know the Fatimid Empire was intellectually, administratively, socially, it was an exemplar, just as other empires were, of course. I'm curious about what was unique about them and different from other empires.
Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. The Fatimids are, first of all, the very name itself, right, from Fatima, which is a very unusual sort of title that they take for themselves, or a name that they draw upon themselves, of course, from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet and the wife of Hazrat Ali. And so the fact that they call themselves the Fatimids is recognition of the fact that they saw themselves as the rightful religious as well as political heirs of the Prophet's authority. And it is something that they invoke right through, even in the first, when Imam al-Mahdi first appears in North Africa, and the Imams are appearing in terms of world stage after 150 years of what has been called the Dor-e-Satar, the period of concealment. And even so, the claim up front is that they are the true descendants of the Prophet and the progeny of the Prophet, who therefore, by that very fact, have the prerogative and responsibility to reign over the Muslim world. So this idea of their Fatimid, their Alid lineage, is something that is really quite distinctive to the Fatimids.
Interesting.
Yes, it's also interesting that in the way that they develop models of governance that they directly draw from the prophetic precedent. So if you look at the Prophet and when he arrives in Medina, the majority of the people in Medina were not Muslim, of course, when he first arrives, and yet he forms what comes to be called the Ummah. And as we know from the so-called Constitution of Medina, that the Ummah constituted Jews and Christians and Muslims. Today that idea would sound completely, odd to people, but in fact that's how the Prophet's Ummah constituted. And you find that the Fatimids do something very similar in that they see themselves as offering dhimma, offering support, offering shade, offering their protection to all those who live under their empire, under their realm, whether they are Sunni Muslims or Malikis, Hanafis, Hanbalis, Shafis, whether they are Shia, Ithna Ashris, whether they are Christians, whether they are Jews. And we know that once the Fatimids moved to Egypt, in fact, the majority indigenous population at that time was very strongly, was Copt Christian. And the Islamization of Egypt was just happening. So it is only at the cusp of the Fatimid arrival in Egypt that the Sunni Muslims actually become a majority in Egypt. So the Copt Christian community, along with other Christian communities, Melkites, Nestorians, and several different Jewish denominations, were all part of the Egyptian scene. And yet all of these folk are provided this guarantee of safety, of continuing to practice in their spaces of worship, of getting justice according to their own madhab, etc. So it's very interesting that while the Fatimids draw from paradigms that are around, for example, they by and large follow the Abbasid model of governance, they create spaces within those which allow for a much more broader inclusion of communities, of people from different communities, whether they're Muslim or not. And in that sense, their administration benefits from a much greater pool of people of competence. The third distinctive point that I'd mention is the fact that in the Fatimid state, the Dawah which is what led to the establishment of the Fatimid state in the first place, continues to receive, it becomes in fact an arm of the state, much like the judiciary and the administration, which is very unusual because if you look at the Abbasids, when they first come to power, they also come on the back of the Abbasid Dawa. But once they arrive in power, very quickly the Dawa is dismantled. Whereas in Fatimid times, the Dawa continues to be the institution through which the role of the Ismaili imamate is portrayed, it's disseminated and furthered, and so the Dais remain involved in the propagation of the Fatimid doctrines and the role of the Imam within that. Within Fatimid lands, but also in other lands. So it's very interesting that they have these, that they maintain those connectors.
Right. And then on the other hand, what, in your opinion, did the Fatimids lack that they could have learned from other empires?
Well, I don't know about lack so much because in that sense they are of course part of the milieu and they draw from each other. But one of the challenges I think that the Fatimids also face is that the fact that they developed this, they cut their teeth about governance in North Africa. So there are times where initially they start off with a model of governance which is much more Ismaili centered and they change. So, when you have the revolt of Abu Yazid, which pushes the Fatimid rule right up to the gates of Mahdiya, when Imam al-Mansur, the third Fatimid Imam Caliph, re-establishes Fatimid sovereignty across across much larger swathes of North Africa. In appointing a governor over Kairouan, for example, previously there was an Ismaili governor, but Kairouan was also a stronghold of Maliki Sunnis who was supported very much by the Umayyads of Spain. And you find that instead of appointing an Ismaili governor, Imam al-Mansur negotiates with the elite, Maliki elite of Kairouan, and a Maliki is appointed as a Fatimid governor. Right. What Madalang, this very well-known scholar of Shia Islam says, this is a major shift in Islamic governance, in Muslim governance. This is a major shift. And so you find that they learn to do these things in North Africa, which of course then they bring in Egypt. But one of the challenges I think that they face in Egypt is that the original power base of the Kutama Berbers, they cannot continue to that base in North Africa, in Egypt in the same way, because now, first of all, Egypt is geographically very far from North Africa, from Ifriqiya, i.e. present-day Tunisia and Algeria, but also the methods of warfare, etc., are very different that they now need to employ, particularly in Syria, which is at that point a buffer between the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Empire, and the Fatimids. And so the Turkish elements get introduced into Fatimid governance. And when you have that introduction, you then find that the Turkish lobby at the Fatimid court and the Berber, generals, etc., over a period of time, really create two clashing opposition groups. And, in times, for example, when Imam al-Hakim is appointed, he was only 11 and a half. These two power blocks really play out. And by the time of Imam Mustansibila, you have this very well-known general called Badr al-Jamali who takes over. He's an Armenian. And he then shifts from just being what has been called the Wazir, the chief minister of the pen, i.e. a scholar, to somebody who is now a chief minister who rules by the sword. Right. And so those shifts in the demography around the Fatimid court, and around the dynamics rather than demography, the dynamics in the Fatimid court start to create fissures that certainly weaken the Fatimids from within. And when that split happens after Imam Mustansibila between Nizar and Musta'ali, of course, to which Badr al-Jamali and his son Al-Afdal were major architects. That then creates certain internal weaknesses that the Fatimids never recover from. It's also a period where there are major external shifts that are happening. The Abbasids, who had become, who were previously being ruled under the Shi'ite Amirs, are now being governed or being supported by the Seljuk Turks, who are very new converts and Sunni, and therefore become a much more are able to hold back the Fatimids or check back their power and influence much more sharply. You also have the Crusaders who come into that whole region. So there are various external shifts that are happening. All of these eventually lead, of course, to a weakening of the Fatimid Empire. But and then, as Ibn Khaldun would remind us, empires rise and empires fall, right? I mean, it's part of that pattern that you find all other empires, So yes, I think those are some of the factors, at least, that one can think about.
Yeah. In speaking of the Fatimid Empire, I believe Maulana Hazar Imam said we can learn from them. And specifically, he says the Fatimid epoch in our history is a significant precursor of attitudes that are appropriate for the 20th and 21st century. It was a time in which intellect played a major role in society, and therefore there are many lessons that come to us from our history and we should learn from, and that we should carry forward in the centuries ahead. Speaking specifically about the role of the intellect and the notion of an intellectual faith, can you highlight what attitudes from the Fatimid Empire to which Hazrat Imam is referring to that we might be lacking today and can perhaps adopt?
Absolutely, I think that's a great question. It's very interesting, that particular quote where he talks about the Fatimid epoch, and he goes on to talk about the role of the intellect, but he also mentions it was a time in which relations between one tariqah in Islam and another were warm and cordial. It's when Muslims and non-Muslims lived and worked happily together, and that so much is therefore learned in terms of attitudes for the 21st century, right? And I find that a really interesting reflection of that period, that he is drawing upon those attitudes and saying those attitudes today are very significant. And if you look at the world in which we live today, right, whereas we are geographically very connected, and we are in terms of technology all joined up, etc., and all of that, yet in fact the polarizations that abound around ethnicity and race and culture and sectarian violence and all that is really rendering us apart in many ways. And this idea of the role of intellect in enabling, in engendering better understanding among peoples within Muslim faiths, peoples of different interpretations within other traditions, Muslim and non-Muslim, that those attitudes today have become are becoming much more challenging somehow to uphold. And you find that when scholars come together, often in scholarship, these ideas of race, of culture, of ethnicity, of sectarianism don't often foreground. What they are really drawing upon is a shared human patrimony of knowledge, right? So if you look at the Quranic notions around seeking knowledge, it talks very often. The Quran will say, do you not think? Do you not ponder? Do you not consider? Right, the role of the intellect, but in that very active sense, it promotes. Right,
it's a large portion.
Absolutely. Similarly, look at the hadiths of the Prophet. Right, seek knowledge even unto China. Learn from cradle to grave. The ink of the scholar is greater than the sword of the martyr. All of these attitudes, this openness to learning that Kindi then talks about, right? As well, that Imam has often referred, that Al-Kindi talks about, this very famous philosopher that Hazrat Imam has referenced in his speeches, to say, seeking knowledge, whatever its source, it ennobles truth, right? That attitude of openness to knowledge is something that you find in this period, and it is not a Fatimid a monopoly or copyright. You find it among the Abbasids, you find it among the Umayyads of Spain, or Muslims of Spain, Umayyads of Spain, and you find it in Fatimid Cairo as well. Which is why you find that, the Beit al-Hikmah that Al-Ma'mun establishes in Baghdad, for example, it starts off with scholars actually who are from different, they are not Muslim. They couldn't be, because they actually knew those original languages, whether it was Persian or Aramaic or Syriac. So these were people coming from different backgrounds, religious as well as ethnic, etc., who come together in the shared endeavor to translate these materials around different disciplines, whether it was philosophy or medicine or astronomy or literature or whatever, folk tales or whatever, but bring that knowledge together and translate it into Arabic, which then becomes a shared, source of knowledge to which Muslim scholars and philosophers contribute. I mean, names like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and others readily come to mind, right? And then you find that endeavor, continuing in Egypt, in Cairo, with the establishment of the Dar al-Hikmah under Imam al-Hakim. And again, very interesting. You see, today we think we can access knowledge. Whether we can or not is another matter. Certainly, we access information by the touch of a button, right?
Right.
But in those days, these materials were written often in very highly prized manuscripts, which were then only the very, only the rulers and some very rich folk could actually afford to make those treasures. And we know the Fatimid libraries were among the best in the world at the time. To make all those collections publicly available in the way that the Dar al-Hikmah allows them to, and for anyone to come and access, and to provide for reading materials, to provide for scholars who then teach all the non-religious sciences. So religious sciences are taught at the Azhar, non-religious sciences from physics to, all of those, medicine, all of those language, all of those are then grammar. They're all taught at the Dar al-Hikmah. And then of course you find similar institutions of learning in Cordoba under the Umayyads. And it is that whole shared heritage that then of course enters into Europe, and Europe re-engages with its own Greek and Latin heritage. And so those attitudes of learning, of engaging, of drawing from a variety of sources and traditions, I think those attitudes are extremely pertinent for our period. And so to me, and they help then people live together, engage together, rather than, divide over which sect you are from, and which country you've come from, and which social strata you might
Even
belong
internally,
to.
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Agreed.
So, speaking about the intellect and the role of the intellect, in the past, the Fatimid Empire uh, and what would be called the Jamaat then engaged in public debates over a variety of issues. And this would include the peers and the dais, what would be called then. And this would not be over only the faith, but over, community challenges and just general issues that were taking place then. This, I think, would expose them to new perspectives and other ideas that would help them in their own faith and their growth in different ways.
Sure.
So, just to give an example, in Ruby of Badakhshan, Alice Huntsberger writes that the Fatimid court at Cairo engendered some of the liveliest theological and intellectual debates in the Muslim world. Astronomers, poets, grammarians, physicians, legal experts, theologians, and other members of the intelligentsia were brought to the capital and given generous stipends and materials for their creative work. So, how can we, as a Jamaat, resurrect the notion of public debate for Ismaili audiences, and not just among the scholars, but even the general Jamaat themselves, to discuss, again, various faith issues, but then also
Issues of the age.
issues of the age, right? And other challenges and
Absolutely, it's a great question again, and I think there are lots of things to consider. You know, going back to the Fatimid times, and again, it wasn't simply they who did it, but there are certainly those who encouraged. They were among those who promoted what was called the munadarat culture. So this idea of public debates, munadarat, that people from different faith traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, would come together and even debate issues around theology, but also other issues, etc. Like you said, Alice's quote there, very much so. And so these ideas of debating, of discussing, of also our dais, if you think of someone like Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani or Kirmani or many of these other great names that today on whose shoulders we stand, really, you look at um, their engagement. It isn't simply writing about Ismaili tracts, as it were. Of course, they were dais, so they wrote about the dawah and they ensured. But even within the dawah, they wrote about a variety of subjects, and much greater than that, they were some of them were seen as avant-garde thinkers of their time. Nasir Khusro still being commemorated today. People like that were not simply Ismaili in their orientation. They of course were, but they also were people who thought about the public issues of the time, of the scholarly issues, of the intellectual debates of the time, and they contributed to that. And I think our engagement in the public square. And one of the ways, I guess, in which we need to create those capacities is, as you said, in-house. But I also think that issues around what Professor Asani would refer to as religious literacy, and how do we ensure that those are not compromised, I guess are those that we also will need to pay attention to as a faith community. And pursuing education with a purpose to betterment of human life, as the Imam would remind us. I think those are all values that we need to draw upon. They've been part of our heritage, and from which, as the Imam keeps guiding us, I think we can then go forward in a much more engaged way, as I said earlier, to become producers of knowledge, not just consumers.
Right. One specific example of youth engaging in debate that comes to my mind is, and I think it was published in Zahur magazine back in the day, was an Ismaili debate. Audience was Ismaili, I think participants were Ismaili, and this was happening in 1955 in Nairobi. And they used to have these debate competitions and speech competitions, and they were discussing societal pressures, and the societal pressure at that time was ballroom dancing.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think the debate had 2,000, 3,000 people attending.
Wow.
And how do you think we can, bring back that culture of public debate and discussion on the societal pressures for Ismailis?
I guess there are different forums, right? I suspect that even now debating societies happen, and they ought to. I think there are some really interesting ways of it's a really useful way of thinking about issues and drawing upon different perspectives, etc. I suspect if I think about the teaching, for example, that the step teachers do, my sense is that debates form a really important part of how those discussions in classroom are had. But the point is a good point to say, are there ways of making those more broader? Yeah, absolutely. I think there is room to do that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, agreed. But you know that even running book clubs, people really struggle, right? Because there is, and that's what I mean. It's just swimming against the grain. I think this whole idea of developing a reading culture is almost seen like a passé thing to do, because you can now, but in fact,
I feel like debates are something people are, actively looking to
yes,
listen to.
absolutely. And look at the Oxford debates that happen. I mean, how many people, tap into those, not just those who are attending, but actually even those who then follow it online, etc. So yeah, no, I think that's a fair point.
I want to shift our conversation to more about faith. We often think faith is uh, faith is just not intellectual, right? It also has a huge emotional component and a deep emotional component. I believe in the past, poetry was one of the way that the emotional component was drawn upon, brought out. What emotional approaches were active, for members of the faith, specifically the Ismaili faith, during the Fatimid period, and that inspired them?
Interesting, absolutely. I think poetry is a very key aspect of it all. For example, it's very interesting that even today, when you look at the Syrian traditions of our Jamaat, they have this corpus of material called al-Anashid al-Diniya, religious poetry, and within that, they actually even today have poetic renditions from someone like Ibn Hani al-Andalusi, interestingly from Andalus originally, then comes to settle at the Fatimid court under Imam Moyes, renderings from Amir Tamim Moyes, who was the oldest son of Imam Moyes, etc. And these all form part of the repertoire of expressions of the Syrian Jamaat even today. And within their tradition, this idea of the affective, of the emotional, of the expressions of poetry. So within the Syrian tradition, these poetic expressions continue to be very live and dynamic. So for example, somebody can compose a poem on, in terms of the love for the Imam, etc. And it can be recited in Jamaat Khana as part of their expressions of faith. So you find that in many Ismaili traditions, similarly, that this happens. So you find that in many Ismaili traditions this happens. It is also true if you look at the broader what has been sometimes called the Nasir Khusro tradition, or the Badakhshan tradition, the broader one. If you look at there, you again find that they draw from a vast repertoire of poetry, of poetic expressions, not just from Ismaili renderings of Nasir Khusro and others, but even, Hafiz and Sadi and Rumi. And these are all seen as figures whose poetic renditions, speak to this idea of, as you said, the expressions, the esoteric understandings and expressions of faith. Art is another major expression, in all its forms, not just, music is another, extremely, it can be extremely evocative and highly spiritual. So these are all elements, I think, that, in the so-called scientific age that we live in, that we need to not lose sight of, and ensure that as a living tradition, we ensure that these expressions remain very much part of the of our Jamati consciousness, and in that sense, the fact that during the Diamond Jubilee we had these expressions of devotion that then kind of were happened at each of the local levels, and then national, and then we had the finale in Portugal and all of that in Lisbon. I thought that that whole expressions element is a very, very key part that we mustn't ever lose sight of.
I agree. I want to talk about another emotional aspect: stories. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in your generation and perhaps your parents' generation, heartwarming stories or anecdotes about the Imam were a critical role that played in developing a person's faith. So today I find this emotional aspect could be perhaps strengthened. And I'm not talking here about the Ghinanic tradition or just oral Imamat stories, but about, I'm thinking how to bring out this emotional component that is applicable, resonant, and with young sensibilities, especially given their skeptical mindset. Just to give an example, I think one of the stories that you use, for example, and about the Fatimid Imams, is Imam Mahdi tells his grandson Al Mansur to get his son Al Muiz, and while he brings him his son Al Qaim, Imam Mansur tells him that there has not been a majlis more illustrious on earth than this one, as four Imams are gathered here. So, what can be done to increase more emotionally driven and narrative based approaches to touch young Ismailis' hearts in today's age?
Here that's where I also feel that, where you started with, that within our own family histories, within our own families, there are these stories, right? So grandparents often are great repositories of these
Absolutely.
stories, and my sense is that we sometimes bypass those or forget, don't create enough opportunities. But listening to these stories from your grandparents, it would give them a really meaningful role in
Absolutely.
our grandchildren's
And we might be
lives.
losing that.
Exactly. And the role of stories are the stuff of life. That
Storytelling, right?
absolutely, storytelling is how human
We
beings
connect.
have lived. Absolutely. And so each family, each person in the family has their story to tell. And often I feel that, as I said, if we could create these opportunities where grandparents and grandchildren could spend some quality time together, and these stories could be then shared, you're not just simply doing storytelling, you are also conveying the values, the worldviews, what it means, to who you are, this key part of our heritage. I think that would be a great way to take things
Absolutely.
forward. So I am all for storytelling, and I do agree entirely that that's a really important medium to convey, um, not just life histories, but values, and what it means, our life, our worldviews as well.
Talking about faith and academics, right? The academic approach is to look at things in a quote unquote objective manner. And I find that, sometimes academics involved in scholarship of the faith they profess sometimes have a difficult time reconciling the two. So, how can academics reconcile confidently their academic work with their faith without being apologetic or shy, perhaps, about their convictions?
It's an interesting point, absolutely. But I guess for me, I mean, if I think I can only answer from what I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to me, the question doesn't arise, at least in my mind, in the sense that as a historian, I am pursuing my discipline as a student of history. Historian is too big a term to use, but as a student of history, I pursue my discipline. I pursue my search. I pursue with the tools of the discipline, and with the rigor that I need to bring to it. And yes, when there are questions that bubble up or arise, you look at those. You bring in other perspectives. You try and understand it from different ways of understanding, and you find ways of reconciling, or you find ways of understanding, and sometimes you don't. And so you live with those questions, and
And that's
that
part of
is
the personal
life.
search.
Absolutely. It is, if everything was settled and it was all done, what would be the pursuit anymore,
Right.
right? So to me, I think, and life is not about certainty. Life is about a search, as you said.
Then, in the
So
same spirit, if I may ask, what would be a question, perhaps even a faith-related question, that you would welcome other perspectives?
well, nothing specific comes to mind in terms of a faith question, but as I said, in terms of searching, in terms of understanding, in terms of discerning, one would want to bring in different perspectives, right? Because that's the only way one can understand, right? If one were only to look in one particular direction or one particular angle, that would be a very limited understanding. So, searching for understandings, um, even in matters of faith, because even when we look at the way faith develops in terms of, for example, practices, in terms of beliefs, in terms of interpretations, those evolve over time in context and of course under the guidance of the Imam of the time. So yeah, I think it remains an ongoing search. It remains an
Absolutely.
ongoing quest, and that's what keeps it meaningful.
I want to end by talking about the future. So we often talk about a vision for the future, and I want to talk about your vision for the future. If you could share a vision for the future, perhaps that the community can achieve in, let's say, 25 years, and then perhaps what insights and suggestions would you give for us to achieve this vision?
I guess I'd want to broaden the question a little, if I
Hmm.
may,
Absolutely.
and yeah, and talk about, if there are issues today that concern me. One issue, for example, I feel quite strongly about is about, our custodianship of the environment in which we live,
Hmm.
right? And this idea that, the earth and its resources are, of course, there for use, but, what use do we make of them, and how can we be responsible in our use of the environment, and how is it that we can better educate. That, particularly in Western contexts where there is so much available, right? There is, the amount of waste that we put out,
Hmm.
which we then also dump onto the, carelessly onto the developing countries. That sense of responsibility, that sense of engaging with the environment, where we better educate, where we better inform, where we therefore, of course, make use of resources, but do so responsibly, where we replenish. We don't simply continually, deplete the
Hmm.
resources. Um, and there are several practical ways in which those can be done, right? I mean, our use of plastic, for example, is a classic case of, I was recently in Tanzania for a family break, and, we were at this small town in which had a beautiful beach. It's still, the beach is very beautiful. And, powdery white sand, and, the lovely ocean, and
Hmm.
but the amount of plastic that was littered right across the shore was truly saddening. It used to be a beach which used to have lots and lots of shells, for example. You barely find any. You find all this dead coral instead. What are we doing to the life of the oceans? What are we doing to the marine life?
Yeah, sadly.
Um, it's very sad, but it's also it feels very, um, it's very callous. It's deliberate. It's not the right word, but it feels very, we are inflicting this, on the environment around us. And for the fact that we are in the 21st century, we are supposed to be much more knowledgeable and much more, as we see ourselves, astute about
Or
the
we
world
claim to
around
be.
us, or we claim to be. We actually are very poor in terms of our record, of how we respect the earth in which we live. So yes, if there is a particular area where I feel quite strongly, and I think it is an issue that we all need to be aware of. I mean, look at what climate change is doing to all of us. Look at what's happening as we speak in America with the floods and all of that. So I do think that yes, those are some of the issues that I feel we need to address better.
Dr. Jiva, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you, Sahil. Thank you.